Professor Rapoport-Albert comes to us from London, where she's Professor Emerita at the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at University College London. And she is the author and editor of numerous works on Hasidism and Sabbatianism, including the most recent Hasidic Studies, Essays in History and Gender. And the topic of today's lecture is the integrity of the female body in Rabbinic tradition. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ada Rapoport-Albert.
Thank you, Wojtek. Thank you all for coming on this cold day. I would say, by way of introduction, I would kind of put my cards on the table at the beginning, even though I could reserve them for the end, because if you've looked at the title I've given, which is The Integrity of the Female Body, and its implication in Rabbinic tradition, and its implications for the Jewish mystical tradition, I would start with the implications, because I'm afraid that by the time I come to the end of what I have to say, I won't have a chance to tell you where it's going. I will tell you that I began thinking about these things years ago in an attempt to understand a simple question, which is why the Jewish tradition does not seem to have a record of any female mystics. And it's a question which some might say is superfluous, because obviously women were not scholars, they were excluded from education, they were excluded from positions of public authority, of leadership, But the point is that both the Christian and the Muslim traditions, which are the two religious traditions that are the most immediate ones that one can see as a wider context for Jewish tradition, because both historically these were the two civilizations that hosted the Jews for most of their history, and also because they're fellow Abrahamic traditions, if you like. We share the same legacy, scriptural legacy, the Muslims less than the Christians, but still. So both the Islamic and the Christian tradition equally exclude women from education, from positions of leadership, exactly the same. But the one avenue that was open for women was the mystical life, where both the Islamic and the Christian tradition have a record, a rich record, which they venerate and celebrate and certainly acknowledge fully, of female mystics. I mean, the Catholic tradition, without its glorious female mystics, would be very impoverished. And the Islamic tradition, even though Islam has the reputation of being extremely, even more misogynistic than the Jewish tradition, in fact, at the very beginning of Sufism, has a cluster of female masters who had disciples whose traditions are preserved and published and learned and inspiring others, and had schools of mystical activity. So why not Judaism? It is not that I don't believe that there were Jewish female mystics. I'm sure that there were women who were attracted to the mystical path, either a learned mystical path, even that, or a more kind of personal spiritual one. What is intriguing is not whether or not there were. That's a question we'll never be able to answer because there's no record. But why it is that the tradition is not capable of capturing this or celebrating it. And so all my considerations of what I'm going to talk about in what follows were triggered by this question. I would also say that I'm not the first person to ask this question. For a long time I was the second, although by now there are quite a few more. The first person who deserves credit for even raising it as a question, because nobody did for an astonishingly long period, was Gershom Scholem, the great founder of Jewish mysticism as an academic discipline. And in his classic Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, he has 3/4 of a page on this. So not much, but the very fact that he raises the question and tries to answer it gives him a lot of credit. And the book was published in the late, I think during the war in 19. It was written, in fact, as a series of lectures in 1936. But the answers he gives, I find not very satisfactory. I don't think he thought about it very seriously. He gives the first answer he gives, which I find completely unconvincing. It is that the Kabbalah, which, bear it in mind, Kabbalah is not commonly used as a name, as a title for the Jewish mystical tradition as a whole, but in fact refers to a very particular school of Jewish mysticism that is medieval in origin, And there were other schools of Jewish spirituality, of mysticism, that predated by centuries. So he says the Kabbalah has a particular affiliation or affinity, establishes a certain affinity between the realm of the demonic, the forces of evil, and the female. So he offers that as a reason. But that doesn't explain why the other schools that predate Kabbalah and similarly don't have any women in their ranks and have the kind of the link between the female and evil goes back to the story of creation, to Genesis, to Eve. And it is there in the classical rabbinic sources. It is there from the very beginning of what we called the Jewish tradition. So it's unconvincing that that would be the barrier. Another reason he offers is even less satisfactory. He says, well, he observes correctly that the Jewish mystics on the whole were quite reticent about their spiritual experiences. In contrast to the rich literature, confessional, autobiographical, visionary literature produced by the mystics of both the Christian and the Islamic tradition, the Jewish mystics tend to abstract, depersonalize. They very rarely speak in the first person. They tend to offer what they experience as a theology or as an impersonal kind of experience. There are exceptions. We do have some mystical diaries, but they're very rare, and they were not published. They were usually circulating, if at all, in manuscript. So it's not a robust part of the tradition at all. The general impression is of reticence about personal things. So Sholem says, well, women generally write in a more personal, confessional, autobiographical way, and because the Jewish tradition of mysticism is so impersonal, and so there were no Jewish women. But I mean, that's completely circular. If we did have female mystics who wrote, then we would have had a Jewish mystical literature that is personal and confessional, and it surely cannot explain why the tradition does not have it. He finally points out to something that has attracted a lot of discussion. The Kabbalah, as you probably know, has a female aspect of the Godhead, which is extremely powerful and active. A lot of Kabbalistic discourse is about the female aspect. The adventures of the female aspect fill many, many pages of Kabbalistic texts. There is no doubt that and I think I mentioned it on Monday's lecture in the context of Chabad's eschatology, there is an old strand and an important one of this vision of the end of days, whereby towards the end of days, as the Messianic age approaches, the powers of the female grow, the female is empowered, and eventually she ascends to be, you remember we mentioned the head of her husband, crowned at the head of her husband. I mean, this trend is definitely there, but the big question is whether it has any relationship to what happens to flesh and blood human women on earth. My feeling is that on the whole, not. I know that a number of important Kabbalistic scholars, Moshe Idel being chief amongst them, argue, and we have argued about it both personally and in public. He believes that it does, that it reflects also on a perception of women as empowered. My own sense is that, if anything, that female aspect of the Godhead, in fact, represents in almost every aspect the stereotypical characterizations of women, or the weaknesses, or the female aspect of the Godhead is ritually impure as a menstruant. She is susceptible, particularly susceptible, to the temptation of the evil forces who are constantly trying to penetrate her sexually. So it's a complex issue. Sholem points it out as a paradox. I don't think that it explains anything. At any rate, the position, these answers are not satisfactory, and what I'm going to talk about, I hope, would suggest an alternative approach to the question. Now, what do I mean by the integrity of the female body? What I would say is that I have in mind a perception of the female body as an entity that is incomposite, that is, in Hebrew philosophical language, pashut, simple, not complex, not made up of different elements, but entirely united within itself, a whole that is incomposite, as opposed to the male body. Now, bear it in mind that I'm not talking about matters of Jewish law. There are no systematic discussions of these issues. What I'm trying is to read certain cultural practices that reflect attitudes, sensibilities. So these are rather fluid things. They're not firm, official positions adopted by anybody. I'm just finding a whole bunch of sources, and they're problematic. Methodologically, it's very problematic because I have to go all over the place. There isn't a single body of sources that would yield enough material. I have to look at quite diverse ones, some of them bodies of sources with which I'm not at all at home. Unlike my lecture on Monday, when I was on firm ground, I was dealing with Hasidism, I've worked in it all my life, I know where I am with Hasidic texts. Here I'm going to periods and types of literature where I'm much less confident that I understand them correctly or that I'm competent to analyze them. But nevertheless, I think it is worthwhile to offer my impression that these texts do yield a certain perception that underlies the attitude to women in this context. Okay, I'll give you an example of one final preliminary comment is that when I'm talking about the Jewish tradition, I mean the tradition that begins with the rabbis. It is Rabbinic Judaism. It is the Judaism that begins with the Mishnah, with the Talmuds, with the Midrashim. It is certainly not biblical Judaism, which is another universe altogether. And it is not even Hellenistic Judaism. But it is it is what shapes the Judaism that we know today. And it is that alone that I'm talking about. So to show you perhaps in one instant, one source, the difference, I will focus on the discussion of a chapter in the book of Leviticus that deals with the laws of ritual purity and impurity in the case of both male and female excretions of fluid from the sexual organs. This is Leviticus chapter 15. The discussion is attempts to classify the kind of incidents that it is considering as regular and irregular. The irregular are the pathological ones, all kinds of diseases. The regular ones are semen for the male and menstrual blood for the female. Very noticeably, the text in the book of Leviticus itself establishes almost perfect symmetry between the case of the male and the female in terms of the impurity that they contract at the time when they experience either ejaculation for the male or, either pathological excretion for the male or a pathological bleeding for the woman, and in turn also the normal one, the perfectly normal, healthy one, which is the ejaculation for the male and the menstrual bleeding for the woman. They both contract it, they have to undergo a certain ritual, they have to go to the temple and bring a turtle or a young dove, offer it sacrifice by the priest, who has to offer one of them as a sin sacrifice and the other one as a burnt offering, and then they are atoned for, and the period of impurity ends. The only difference is between the male who who stays in a state of impurity after an ejaculation, a normal production of semen, until the evening, and that is understandable because it is a very brief experience, whereas the woman has to count 7 days until she's rendered pure. So there is nothing in the biblical text itself that suggests a fundamental difference between the two. When you look at Tanaitic source, you look at the Midrash, halachic Midrash called Sifra, which is the Midrash on the book of Leviticus. And here I'm following the analysis of Charlotte von Robert, who wrote a wonderful book about menstruation in the Jewish and Christian tradition. And she observes that the Sifra focuses is aware that there is symmetry in its source, in the Leviticus text, but focuses on one very small linguistic difference in the language that the scripture chooses to refer to either the man or the woman. In the case of the man, it speaks of the impurity that comes out of his body, mi besaro, from his flesh, comes out mi, using the Hebrew preposition me, from. Whereas in the case of the woman's menstruation, it is bivsara, in her body, in her flesh. And the Sifra, the Rabbinic Midrash, observes that what do we learn from the difference in the preposition mi and be? We learn that in the case of the man, his impurity is only when this liquid, the fluid, polluting fluid, comes out of his body. That's the moment that it is impure. Whereas in the case of the woman, it is inside her, whether it comes out or not. It is always there, inside her body. It is a part of her body. And there follows a discussion of the architecture of the female sexual reproductive organs, speculating about how high up the blood originates, and the terminology is very architectural. It is the chamber and the vestibule and the attic or the upper chamber, and halachic authorities who have to deal with this in cases when they have to determine whether a blood is menstrual or not, have grappled for centuries with the precise meaning of these terms, because nobody knows exactly. And doctors today have to try to translate these terms into terminology that makes sense in terms of physiology, but nobody quite knows exactly what they had in mind. What is clear, however, is that they perceive the blood as inherent in the woman's body, and it actually is there all the time. So she is identified with her menstruation in a way in which the man is not. It is something that goes through, comes out of him, and then it's finished. I don't know if this is the right moment, but I would mention by association, it's not directly relevant, but there is a tradition that appears in medieval Hebrew literature, but has its origins in Aristotle, about the drops of blood, the gutai sanguinae. And this is obviously a folk belief that when a menstrual woman looks in the mirror, what she sees is drops of blood. And this is, I first came across it in Nachmanides' comment on that passage in Vayikra, and since then have found it in quite a few other medieval authors. But I also know that it is available in non-Jewish traditions as well. It is a very interesting perception. You know, a woman, when she looks at the mirror, she would see herself. And what she sees as herself is the drop of blood. You know, it is a kind of implicitly a view of the woman as actually constituting the blood of her menstruation. There are terms that are used in rabbinic culture for woman, which are intriguing. Most of them have their origin in biblical texts, but they are used sometimes simply metaphorically, and sometimes as a matter of course. For example, all these kind of architectural structures of the location of the blood within the woman's, the menstrual blood within the woman's body, women actually are called in rabbinic culture bait, house. A house, that is the wife, and in fact that is common usage among certain Orthodox groups, Hasidic groups to this day. Woman is makor. Makor is a fountain, a source. Etymologically, the word makor, source in Hebrew, comes from the root kuf vav reish, and it basically means a round hole. And it is a very crude perception of the source, the Hebrew text, the biblical Hebrew text, in describing the place from which the blood comes out. In other contexts, refers to it as makor. a man who sleeps with a menstrual woman, he exposes her nakedness, he exposes her source, et mekora he'era. The term makor, the whole, becomes a term for a woman. Makor is a woman. Guf. Now, guf is a reflexive in Hebrew. And I think that in rabbinic literature, in the classical rabbinic sources, it is still used only as a reflexive. Hu gufo, he himself. It is a way of saying oneself. But it nevertheless is used as gufo, his body, that is his wife. In certain contexts, his wife is like himself. I think all these usages, also, yes, basar, flesh. Metaphorically, women are likened to flesh, meat even in certain contexts. A man is permitted to do anything he wants with his wife, it means sexually, just like when he's eating meat, Or these things are usually cited as evidence of misogyny. I'm not so interested in them in that sense. I'm more interested in the close affiliation between body, flesh, sexual organs, menstruation, as menstruation effectively is the woman's sexuality. It is defining her sexuality in these terms, in these passages. So these terms are used for women as a matter of course, long before, by the Middle Ages, the duality, the binary of body and soul, which is already in classical rabbinic sources, acquires also the values of male and female, which is a legacy again of classical Greek traditions, both Platonic and Aristotelian, and so woman becomes associated as a matter of course with body, flesh, or with matter, as opposed to male, who is mind, soul, spirit, or form. Matter and form is the one pair, the Aristotelian one, or body and soul is the other. And that becomes a cliche of medieval onwards literature, kabbalistic literature as well. So the sexuality of the woman is really comprising her in a way in which the man's sexuality does not. It is associated with a particular part of his body, and the fluid that comes out of it momentarily is out of his body, whereas the woman has it residing within herself. And if we needed any more evidence that the woman's body is considered sexual, so woman is sexuality. Woman, the presence of a woman anywhere, in any situation, immediately introduces sexual tension. Sexuality is woman. Look at a few examples. We have in the Talmud, in famous texts in Brachot, often cited again as evidence of misogyny, an arm's breadth, a hand breadth, a tefach, in a woman is her nakedness. Any exposed part of any part of the body in a woman is nakedness. Now, the text goes on to say that perhaps it is superfluous to make this comment because a few minutes before, another sage has already listed that the biblical verse in which the kind of jewelry that women wear outside their bodies, such as rings, necklaces, armbands, are listed together with the kind of jewel that women wear inside the body. And there is a term, an obscure term, kumaz, for this jewel that is worn inside the body. And the Talmud elsewhere explains to us what kumaz is. It is ze dufus shel beit harechem. It is the mold of the vagina. And women are supposed to be wearing it inside it, a piece of gold jewelry that is molded to fit inside the vagina. Now, the rabbis, the names of these jewels come from the biblical text in which, after the revelation at Sinai, the people is asked to donate gold and silver and precious stones for the building of the tabernacle. And the women give of their jewels. And so there are lists of these jewels. The Talmud also goes on to read the word kumaz acronymically as kan mekom zima. This is a place of whoredom, about this jewel, disapproving. So this sage says that it is not even necessary to point out that just one hand's breadth on the exposed in a woman's body is her nakedness, because there's no difference, as far as women are concerned, between the jewels they wear on the outside and the jewels they wear inside their sexual organ. And it is accompanied by a list of declarations that any part of the female body is her nakedness. Her leg is her nakedness, shok bisha, the voice of a woman, the hair of a woman. This, of course, has implications. This is why women should not speak in public, should not sing before men, and so on. Any part of the female body is sex. She marks sexuality by her very presence. However, the reason why I'm not so interested in this as misogyny is that basically this integrity, the whole body, the whole female body is sex, is perfectly legitimate. It is acknowledged as legitimate in its own way. And so, as evidence, I suggest, we have the commandment of ona. A husband is commanded to satisfy the sexual urge of his wife, regardless of procreation. I mean, this is whether she's still fertile or not, whether she's a woman who bearing children, whether she's pregnant or not. It is independent of procreation. And it is something that people are reminded they should do on a regular basis, because the wife's sexual needs are fully legitimate and recognized. Bear it in mind also that the commandment of be fruitful and multiply, or at least what the rabbis understood as a commandment, applies only to men, not to women. It is almost as if the men would never dream of doing it unless they were commanded to do it. It is the women who naturally would be engaged in it. But the men have to be doing it as a commandment in order to procreate. There is also a difference in the way the male and the female bodies are represented symbolically. The male body is circumcised. And although whatever the reasons originally in the biblical setting for circumcision were, and we'll never really know them, there's no question that in the Middle Ages it was clearly understood, Maimonides is well known for saying it, but many others follow, it was a device designed to attenuate the sexual urge. Jewish men are circumcised in order to have less of a sexual appetite. And they're famous for it, so much so that is the reason why some Jewish women whore with males who are not Jewish, because they have more of a sexual appetite. I came across in one sermon. So the symbolic marking of the male body, also the male body is the arena for performing mitzvot. You lay tefillin on your arm, the man, not the woman, or on your head. You wear a prayer shawl, you wear the tzitzit. The body is the instrument for fulfilling the mitzvot, the holy commandment. Not so the female body. There's nothing on the female body. Women are presumed to be born as if they are already circumcised. According to the Talmud. In fact, the issue of why Jewish women are not circumcised is one of the topics in medieval Jewish-Christian polemics, where the Christian side challenges the Jewish side in saying, well, explain to us, how does it work? Are all your women not Jewish because they're not circumcised? And you can see that the Jewish representatives on these public disputations are very embarrassed. They're cornered and they offer all kinds of strange explanations, none of them particularly satisfactory. Mostly they say that menstruation is the equivalent to the, but that is not substantiated, not consistent. So the female body is free from these symbolic representations of the spiritual and the divine, and the connection with the divine. This is even evident in a practice that I first came across, and some of you may know, of the Hasidim of today. Hasidim of today who wear the garter, the belt that separates the upper from the lower part of the body. And the rationale is that so that the heart would not see the nakedness of the man, to separate the spiritual and intellectual faculties from the base physical, sexual faculties. This custom has its origin in the Talmud. It is assumed to have been abandoned over time. There's even in the medieval Machzor Vitri, a collection of halachot and prayers from Ashkenaz from the 12th century, there's a comment explaining that in Babylon, at the time of the Talmud, men wore the garter because they were in the habit of wearing gowns, whereas in Eretz Israel, in the Holy Land, men wore trousers which had a belt, and therefore it was not necessary. And that is why eventually the practice was dropped. However, it is a practice which was not just revived by 18th century Hasidim, pietists, who did it regardless of the fact that they also wore trousers. But I happened to come across, and this is just an incidental, anecdotal piece of evidence, but one that pleased me when I saw it. There is a Swiss late 16th century traveler. He was the son of a very well-known humanist, Thomas Platter. The father was a humanist. His son is particularly known because of his travel books. He was born in Switzerland, embarked all his life on travels all through Europe. He went through Germany, to France, down to Spain, to England. He visited London. He even saw the globe. In English, they celebrate the chapter that described his experience of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. I came across the description of his visit to Avignon in France, and he focuses, most of his description is about the Jews of Avignon. He says there are only a few hundred, but they dominate the market. They are wheeling and dealing, and you see them everywhere. They're very present. And he describes what they look like, and he describes what he learns from talking to them. And one of the first things he says is every male Jew at the age of 13 has to start wearing a belt around his waist to separate, and he gives the reason, to separate his upper faculties from his lower faculties. So there is indication that the practice never really died out completely, and is not just revived in early Hasidism and from then on today as well. So that too is evidence that the male body is composite. The male body has its upper faculties and its lower faculties. It is the arena for performing mitzvot, for subduing the physical in order to enhance the spiritual. The female body is incomposite. It is entirely physical, and for physical I read sexual. This takes me to the attitude to the ascetic life, the ascetic regimen. Self-mortification, self-deprivation, abstention from food, from drink, from sexual relations, physical discomfort, all kinds of physical deprivations. We know that rabbinic tradition has got quite a lot of context in which ascetic practice is the appropriate thing. We also know that there is a certain tension between this posture and the kind of world-affirming posture that is the one that is more often than not associated with Judaism. It's much more healthy-minded. It is pro-marriage, pro-procreation. The world is God-created and beautiful. We should bless for every pleasure we taste and we eat. We should maintain the body in good order in order to perform mitzvot with it. It is God created and there's nothing wrong with it. So there is a clash, and a lot has been written about it. I know that people who work on Talmudic sources, on the classical rabbinic sources, would make distinctions that I'm not myself able to judge between the Palestinian and the Babylonian attitude. I think Danny Boyarin suggests that the Babylonians were much more anxious about the conflict between these two postures that are, I believe, irreconcilable, and which really in post-Talmudic Judaism, increasingly from the Middle Ages on, become very, very fraught. The tension between these two orientations is never really resolved and manifests itself in a few bizarre practices. I think that two mechanisms are born that are really capable of relaxing some of this tension. One of them is the relegation of commitment to the ascetic life, to an elite. It could be the intellectual elite, it could be the spiritual elite, the mystical elite, the magical elite. We know that the state of the usual phraseology is bikdusha v'tahara. Certain situations, certain activities have to be performed in a state of holiness and purity. And that is usually shorthand for a period of ascetic deprivation, a fast, a prolonged fast, certainly abstention from sex, also from wine and meat, sometimes from other foods. We have that in the context of various texts that we describe as either magical or mystical. A person who is a writer of amulets, for example, is instructed to be very careful and to embark on a period of abstention before he does it, because it's very dangerous otherwise. So there is a recognition of the value of self-deprivation, ascetic self-deprivation, for elites, not for everybody. This is even evident in a mainstream Mishnaic text that prescribes different periods of abstention from sex with one's wife for different professions. This is in the Mishnah. So according to your profession, you are allowed either a longer or a shorter interval between each performance of the commandment of ona, of sexual gratification of your wife. And sailors, for example, who go in the sea for weeks, they have a long interval. But people who work, craftsmen who work at home, should do it at least once a week. Scholars have the longest license. They can go on, and in fact, the ideal type of the scholar who is a monk, the married monk, I think he has been called, or the married eunuch, the person who maintains the ascetic life, sometimes for most of his life, within marriage, having got through the commandment of procreation, produce a male and a female child, and then spending decades away from home, we presume abstaining, we don't have any evidence that they don't, is an ideal, is venerated. This is regarded as a mark of sanctity. The models are Rabbi Akiva, the most famous one, who with his wife's permission and blessing, goes off for 12 years and then again another 12 years to study away from home. There is a real lifelong abstinent, Ben Azai, a problematic model, a venerated sage, Tanaitic sage, who refuses to marry. He wants to devote his life to Torah. So you can see the conflict between Torah and marriage. He recognizes that you cannot do both. Now, he's problematic because he's one of the four who ascend to heaven, to Pardes, and peeps in and dies. So he's not a clean model, but nevertheless a problematic but a venerated model. There's even some evidence of veneration for elite groups of virginity. Virginity doesn't feature much in kind of normally when we think of the Jewish tradition. In terms of girls, a virgin, a Jewish girl who is a virgin, is simply not a fully developed thing. There's nothing holy, nothing spiritual about her condition. She's simply not yet finished. And once she reaches sexual maturity, she fulfills her role by marriage. Unlike the tremendous value that the Christian tradition places on virginity, both in men and in women. I think that for women, virginity counts as nothing other than value in the marriage market. But for men, there are certain indications I've collected from here and there that seem to venerate virginity in men. One passage is in a commentary by Nachmanides, and it appears quoted by others on a particular biblical verse in which Bachurei Israel, the young men of Israel, are described as the young men of Israel who are going to, this is construed as a comment on a biblical verse that speaks about the wonderful scent, the scent that would be exuded by the young men who are pure, who have never known sin. And as if we didn't understand fully, sin is expounded as who have never known a woman. young men who have never sinned, בחורי ישראל שלא ידעו טעם חטא, and then by way of explanation, who have never known a woman, are the ones who would excuse this wonderful heavenly scent. A peculiar notion, but alongside it, I count another mysterious document, which is called Chukei HaTorah, the laws of the Torah. This is a medieval document, first published in the 19th century by Gideman, subsequently published several other times. Intriguing always. Provenance is not clear. It could be Ashkenaz, it could be Provence. Some people even speculated further afield, which refers to Batei HaPushim, the houses of the abstinents, where young men picked from families of priests, Kohanim, and Levites, who are selected at a young age and sent to the houses of the abstinents, where they devote their lives to study. I mean, this is a monastic institution, and they describe in kind of legal terms the rules of conduct in that institution. They have a head of a yeshiva who comes to teach them Torah. He spends the week with them. At the weekend, he goes back to his home. He's married, and he goes back to fulfill the commandment of Onah with his wife. And then he comes back at the beginning of the week for another week, but he has to ritually bathe, to immerse himself and wash his clothes, to purify himself from his sexual activity before he goes back to this monastic setting. Scholars who publish it were bewildered by it because it is unique. They said it is a utopian thing, it is some kind of fantasy, but we don't know. We just do not know. It is intriguing that such a document could have existed. And there are other examples I don't have time to give you of even virginity being celebrated as an ideal. For the other mechanism that I suggest is relaxing some of the tension, that the clash between the conflicting directives about the world of sexuality, of physicality, mundane existence, and the world of Torah is this, I think, unique gendering of asceticism. I mean, asceticism for men is fine, but for women, not only is it not fine, it is categorically condemned and systematically suppressed in a most peculiar way. Peculiar because it is the ascetic life which enables women in the Christian tradition, in the Islamic tradition, to do precisely that, to transcend the limitations of gender. It is that enables them to achieve the entry ticket into the realm of the mystics who are saintly and celebrated and recorded and whom the tradition is proud of. We know that this was never unproblematic, even for the women who chose to live within women's communities, monastic communities. Nevertheless, it was almost a precondition for all. And it is peculiar that in the rabbinic tradition, it is very clearly gendered. I would say that, first of all, that the wives of the men who embark on decades of travel away from home and study are effectively also celibates, for all those periods. But this never counts as a religious value for them. It is a self-sacrifice. It is a willingness to suffer, but it doesn't empower them. It doesn't give them any enhancement of spiritual or intellectual faculties. It is entirely geared towards the development of their husbands. So there are all these women who are effectively celibate within marriage, but it doesn't count as a religious value at all, as it does for the men. But the actual abstinent woman as a category does appear in one context and is condemned unequivocally in no uncertain term. This is in the tractate Sotah, where we have this is first in the Mishnah, it appears also in the Babylonian, in the Palestinian Talmud, in the Tosafot, and there's a long tradition of commentary on that passage, which is almost entirely consistent in its unequivocal condemnation of the abstinent woman, Isha Pusha. The term Isha Pusha is a bit enigmatic, and I know that my colleague Tali Ilan, who is a feminist scholar of the Talmud, has suggested that it has to be understood not as an abstinent woman, but as a Pharisaic woman, which may well be, I mean, I can't judge. But the tradition understands it as abstinent and condemns it as an abstinent. So the woman who is an abstinent, abstaining from life's pleasures, from physical pleasures, above all from sexuality, is denounced as, I mean, the Talmud asks, what does it mean? What is it? It is either a virgin who spends all day fasting, betula saimanit, or a virgin who spends all day praying, saimanit, salyanit, and both of them are condemned as inherently hypocritical. They're doing it in order to appear to be pious, and in fact they're concealing their lascivious thoughts and actions. The other is the widow, the gadabout widow, the widow who goes around. Widows have a bad reputation not just in rabbinic tradition. She goes around, she's a witch. There are various attempts to exemplify what it is. The Talmud does suggest that maybe there are exceptions, but the weight of the interpretation that follows does not take the objection seriously. And so systematically, the virgin and the widow are condemned as the abstinents, who are defined as mevalei olam. They belong to the category of destroyers of the world, which is a very serious label. Note, however, that the married woman who is an abstinent does not feature even in the imagination, even though you have so many married men who are effectively that and who are venerated. But the possibility that a woman would count in the same way does not even occur to the authors of the text. So there's only the virgin or the widow. And, and this text, it is not a halachic text. You know, the issue of the abstinent woman is not a halachic category. We don't have the tractate of the abstinent. If we did, it would have been very interesting to see what we would have in it. This is just one passage in a non-halachic text in the Talmud. And you have a long tradition of commentary on it by people who comment on this particular tractate, on the Agadic part of this tractate. And all of them, without exception, insist on the rejection of this type of woman in no uncertain terms. Unfortunately, I'm coming to, how much time should I be winding down now? Yeah. So I don't have time to read you the examples that I've collected from various genres. Again, this is the methodological problem. I have stories, examples from the 15th century, the 16th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, different parts of the world. Stories about women who attempt to do this. The most famous one I wrote about years ago, and we mentioned it on Monday, is The Maid of Ludmi, a classic example of a girl who chooses to be a Hasidic Rebbe. So she embraces the ritual observance of a man, or the kabbalist. She dresses like a man, she prays like a man, she refuses to marry. And the rabbinic leadership, the Hasidic leadership of her time, quashes it, forces her to marry. And I found versions of this story in Baghdad in the 12th century, in the Cairo Geniza document. I found stories like that in the Vilna circle, the Gaon of Vilna, in places that are in North Africa. So there are traditions that confirm this from lots of different places. That in itself may suggest that it is profoundly felt and not systematically articulated as a kind of a remedy to the methodological problem of having no coherent body of sources where one can find the evidence. I would conclude by just pointing out that because of the paucity of direct evidence, I thought that I would look at other areas of Jewish practice that have the ascetic regimen built into them. And because the ascetic regimen is always the same, it's basically the same. No sex, no meat, no wine, physical discomfort, sleep rough on the ground, sometimes sackcloth, wear sackcloth and spread ashes on your head. All these elements appear time and again and already originate in the biblical text. So the areas that I looked at, which confirmed it in a very implicit way, one is the issue of vows, making vows, nedarim, particularly Nazirite vows, which in the Hebrew Bible are perfectly straightforward, and people can vow to abstain from, particularly abstention from certain things. The rabbis don't like them. The position of the Nazirite is ambiguous. Is he a sinner? Is he a saint? They don't like it. But in Jewish law about vows, the husband has the right to annul the vows that his wife makes. The father has the right to annul the vows that his daughter makes, his mature daughter, bogeret, the daughter who has reached sexual maturity, if they are going to be harmful to her body. Anything that would diminish her sexual attraction, he can cancel. I thought that was very telling, that men can do it, but women don't, even though the whole issue is ambiguous. The other one is mourning, the whole laws of mourning, where symbolically, in a very significant way, the precedent and the phrase used, and this begins in the Talmud, it's in the codes, in the Shulchan Aruch, it is still today, although it is not much noticed, שלא תתנבל על בעלה, for the sake of not becoming disgusting to her husband. A woman should not do, even if it is motivated by the desire, in the case of mourning, to express mourning for her most intimate relatives who have died, parents, brothers, sisters, children. So the period in which she is not to wash is much shorter than the period that a man should not wash. The period in which she is not to do up her hair, to cut her hair, much shorter. It's symbolically there. I mean, she's to do it, but only for 3 days, for 7 days rather than 30, for a week rather than a month, or for a year in some cases. She's not allowed to abstain from making up. Pirkus, and anoint herself and use makeup. She should remain attractive. There's no doubt that being attractive trumps expressing mourning, etc. And finally, and that is the one area where I have the most material and unfortunately don't have the time or the means now to share it with you, it is penitential practices. Penitential practices, often ascetic, and we have certain bodies of sources where they are described in alarmingly violent terms. In medieval Ashkenaz, we have not only the Book of the Pious, but particularly the Hilchot Tshuva, the laws of penitence. Penitence is not a matter of law, but this particular authority, Elazar of Worms, in the 13th century in the Rhineland, formulates them as if they were laws. They're very important. And they are astonishing in their extremity for sexual transgressions, where men and women are equally partners, adulterers. He prescribes mortification that includes self-flogging, not only long fasts, flogging, exposing the body to the cold in the snow, burying oneself naked in the snow in winter, or in a nest of hornets or of flies or of ants in the summer. So, I mean, really very, very florid descriptions of the horrible tortures one should afflict upon oneself in order to atone for sexual transgressions. All of it is written in the masculine and seems to include only the man, not a word about the part of the woman. There are some later halachists who, in their responsa, I've got one beautiful one of Yair Bachrach from the late 17th century, who notices that the Rokeach does not appear to prescribe physical penances to women. And he uses that as a basis himself for ruling that whereas the husband who has committed this adulterous act, I think, in that case it was a man, I can't remember what the sin was, but it was a couple who were equally blameworthy. I can't remember if they were married. At any rate, he should embark on all these mortifications. For the wife, he said, he used again a Talmudic phrase, asher tavla, we should do to her what is appropriate for her. So she should be shamed, she should confess, she should be punished by embarrassment, but her body should not be interfered with. And there is a general, it's not consistent. In Spain, for example, we know that there was some very harsh physical penalties afflicted, but a general reluctance to interfere with the female body, because there's no point in mortifying it, because it is as if you are punishing the woman for what she is, for herself. You are diminishing her very being rather than punishing. Okay, I'll have to stop here. And I hope that I've managed to convey what was quite difficult to offer as a coherent picture out of these fragments that I put before you.